The story begins in the tents of Isaac, the son of Abraham, when he had grown old and his eyes were dim with age. Isaac called to his elder son Esau, a skillful hunter and man of the field, and said to him, "My son, I am old and do not know the day of my death. Take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me. Prepare for me the delicious food that I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die." But Rebekah, Isaac's wife, overheard these words. Her heart was with Jacob, the younger twin, the quiet man who dwelt in tents. She remembered the prophecy given to her before the twins were born. "Two nations are in your womb, and the older shall serve the younger." While Esau was away hunting, Rebekah devised a plan of deception. She spoke urgently to Jacob, "Go to the flock and bring me 2 good young goats, that I may prepare from them delicious food for your father, such as he loves. You shall take it with your father, that he may eat and bless you before he dies." Jacob hesitated, fear creeping into his voice. "Behold, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him and bring a curse upon myself and not a blessing." But Rebekah was determined. "Let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice." She prepared the savory food and took the best garments of Esau and put them on Jacob. She covered his hands and the smooth part of his neck with the skins of the young goats. When Jacob approached his father with trembling hands, Isaac was suspicious. The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. Yet Isaac was deceived by the disguise and the aroma of the field that clung to Esau's garments. He blessed Jacob with the blessing meant for the firstborn. "May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you." No sooner had Jacob left his father's presence than Esau returned from his hunting. When he learned what had happened, Esau cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, "Bless me, even me also, O my father." But Isaac could only give him a lesser blessing, for the greater blessing had already been spoken and could not be recalled. From that day forward, Esau harbored hatred toward Jacob. He said in his heart, "The days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob." When these words were told to Rebekah, she called Jacob and said, "Your brother Esau comforts himself about you by planning to kill you. Arise, flee to my brother Laban in Haran." Jacob fled into the wilderness, carrying nothing but his staff and the clothes on his back. On his first night, he lay down to sleep with stones for his pillow and had a dream of a ladder reaching from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending upon it. The Lord stood above it and renewed the covenant made with Abraham and Isaac, promising to give Jacob the land and to make his offspring like the dust of the earth. When Jacob reached Haran, he found his uncle Laban's household and immediately fell in love with Rachel, Laban's younger daughter. Her eyes were beautiful, and she was lovely in form and appearance. Jacob agreed to work 7 years for Laban in exchange for Rachel's hand in marriage, and those years seemed to him but a few days because of his love for her. But Laban was as cunning as Jacob had been. On the wedding night, he substituted Leah, the older daughter whose eyes were weak, for Rachel. When Jacob discovered the deception in the morning, Laban said, "It is not done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years." So Jacob worked 14 years for his 2 wives. The Lord saw that Leah was unloved and opened her womb, while Rachel remained barren for many years. Leah bore Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Rachel, in her desperation, gave her servant Bilhah to Jacob, and she bore Dan and Naphtali. Not to be outdone, Leah gave her servant Zilpah to Jacob, and she bore Gad and Asher. Then Leah bore Issachar and Zebulun, and finally a daughter, Dinah. At last God remembered Rachel, and she conceived and bore Joseph. During these years Jacob's flocks multiplied exceedingly. He had learned the arts of animal husbandry and selective breeding, and through cunning agreements with Laban, he accumulated vast wealth in livestock. He had large flocks of sheep and goats, herds of camels and cattle, and many servants. Yet Laban's sons began to resent Jacob's prosperity, saying, "Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's, he has gained all this wealth." Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him had changed. The face that once welcomed him warmly now regarded him with suspicion and jealousy. It was then that the Lord appeared to Jacob in a dream and said, "Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you." Jacob called Rachel and Leah to the field where his flock was and explained his situation. "I see that your father does not regard me with favor as he did before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed." Both Rachel and Leah agreed to leave their father's house, saying, "Is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has been using up the money given for us." So Jacob arose and set his sons and his wives on camels, and he drove away all his livestock and gathered all his possessions. The caravan that departed from Haran was impressive in its size and wealth. Hundreds of sheep and goats, dozens of camels and cattle, servants and their families, and all the goods Jacob had accumulated over 20 years. For 3 days they traveled before Laban learned of their departure. He pursued them with his kinsmen for 7 days until he overtook them in the hill country of Gilead. But God came to Laban in a dream and warned him, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." After a tense confrontation and negotiation, Jacob and Laban made a covenant of peace, setting up a pillar of stones as a witness between them. They called the place Mizpah, saying, "May the Lord watch between you and me when we are out of each other's sight." As Jacob continued his journey toward Canaan, his thoughts turned increasingly to his brother Esau. 20 years had passed since he had fled in fear of his life. What had become of Esau in those years? Had his anger cooled, or had it festered into an unquenchable thirst for revenge? Jacob's wealth might seem like further insult to Esau, evidence that the blessing he had stolen had indeed brought prosperity. The servants who traveled with Jacob began to speak among themselves, noting their master's growing anxiety. Children who had been born in Haran asked their mothers why their father seemed so troubled. Rachel, now great with child again, watched her husband pace restlessly each evening as they made camp. As they neared the borders of Seir, Jacob's homeland, he made a decision. He selected several of his most trusted servants and instructed them carefully. "Go before me to my lord Esau and say, 'Thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male servants, and female servants. I have sent to tell my Lord, in order that I may find favor in your sight." Jacob chose his words with the wisdom born of years of negotiation and diplomacy. He called Esau his Lord and himself Esau's servant, attempting to show humility and deference. He mentioned his wealth not to boast, but to demonstrate that he had prospered and was not returning as a desperate fugitive seeking charity. The messengers departed at dawn, riding swift camels across the rugged terrain toward Mount Seir. Jacob and his household continued their slower journey, but with each passing hour, Jacob's apprehension grew. He found himself starting at shadows, mistaking dust clouds for approaching armies, and lying awake at night staring at the stars. When the messengers returned 3 days later, their faces were grave. They had found Esau, and he had listened to their message with an unreadable expression. "We came to your brother Esau," they reported, "and he is coming to meet you, and there are 400 men with him." 400 men. The number struck Jacob. This was not a family reunion. This was a military force. Esau had become a powerful chieftain in the land of Seir, and he was approaching with what could only be described as a small army. Jacob's mind raced through the possibilities. Perhaps Esau intended to surround him, to prevent any possibility of escape this time. Perhaps he planned to take everything, Jacob's family, his wealth, his life, as payment for the stolen blessing. Terror seized Jacob's heart, but he did not panic. The years with crafty Laban had taught him to think quickly and strategically. He immediately divided his household into 2 camps. If Esau attacked one group, perhaps the other could escape. He separated his wives and children, his servants and flocks, creating distance between the 2 groups so that both could not be taken at once. But tactical preparation was not enough. That night, Jacob did something he had rarely done with such desperate intensity. He prayed. Falling on his face before God, he cried out, "O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, 'Return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good.' I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. With only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become 2 camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, 'I will surely do you good, and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude.'" Even as he prayed, Jacob's mind worked on another approach. If he could not flee and he could not fight, perhaps he could appease. He selected from his flocks an enormous gift for Esau, 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milking camels and their colts, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. He divided these animals into separate droves and instructed his servants to space them out along the route. Each group was to approach Esau separately, with the servants saying, "They belong to your servant Jacob. It is a gift sent to my lord Esau, and moreover, he is behind us." Jacob reasoned that wave after wave of valuable gifts might soften Esau's heart before they actually met face to face. As evening approached, Jacob made his final preparations. He took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and sent them across the ford of the Jabbok River. Everything he owned, every animal, every servant, every precious possession, was moved to the other side of the water. But Jacob himself remained alone on the south side of the river. Perhaps he needed time to think, to prepare himself mentally for what might be his final night alive. Perhaps he wanted to pray once more in solitude. The night was clear, with stars scattered like diamonds across the dark sky. The rushing water of the Jabbok provided a constant murmur in the darkness. It was then, in that solitary place, that the most extraordinary encounter of Jacob's life began. Out of the darkness came a figure, a man, yet more than a man. Without warning, without explanation, this mysterious being seized Jacob and began to wrestle with him. It was not the quick violence of an attack, but the sustained struggle of a wrestling match, each opponent seeking to gain advantage over the other. Jacob had always been the clever one, the one who won through cunning rather than strength. But in this strange nocturnal contest, there was no room for deception or trickery. It was strength against strength, will against will, endurance against endurance. Hour after hour, they wrestled in the darkness. Jacob's muscles strained and burned. His breath came in gasps. Sweat poured from his body. Yet he would not yield. Every time his opponent seemed to gain advantage, Jacob found new reserves of strength and determination. This was not merely a physical contest. It felt like a struggle for his very soul, his destiny, his future. As the night progressed, something extraordinary became clear. The mysterious wrestler, despite his supernatural nature, could not overcome Jacob by strength alone. Jacob's determination, his refusal to surrender, his desperate need for blessing, gave him a power that transcended mere physical ability. As dawn began to break in the east, painting the sky with the faintest hint of light, the wrestler did something that changed the nature of their contest forever. He touched Jacob's hip socket, and immediately Jacob felt something give way. A dislocation, a wrenching that sent fire through his leg and hip. Yet even wounded, even limping, Jacob maintained his grip on his mysterious opponent. "Let me go," the wrestler said, "for the day is breaking." But Jacob, gasping with pain and exhaustion, tightened his hold. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." In that moment, wounded and struggling, Jacob finally understood something profound. This was no ordinary man he had been wrestling with through the night. This was a divine being, perhaps an angel, perhaps the Lord himself in visible form. And if he was to receive blessing, it must be now, in this moment of desperate struggle. "What is your name?" the wrestler asked. "Jacob," he replied. And in speaking that name, he acknowledged all that it represented: the supplanter, the deceiver, the one who had grasped his brother's heel from birth and had been grasping for advantage ever since. Then came words that would echo through all of history. "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." A new name, not just a new title, but a new identity, a new destiny. No longer Jacob the supplanter, but Israel, the one who strives with God. The blessing he had stolen from his father through deception was now confirmed by God himself through honest struggle. "Please tell me your name," Jacob asked, but the divine wrestler replied, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. As the sun rose fully, Jacob found himself alone by the river. He called the place Peniel, the face of God, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been preserved." The encounter had marked him forever. Not only did he carry a new name and a new blessing, but his body bore the permanent reminder of this night. He would limp for the rest of his life, a physical sign of his wrestling with the divine. As Jacob limped across the ford to rejoin his family, he was a transformed man. The fear that had consumed him was replaced by a strange peace. He had wrestled with God himself and had not been destroyed but blessed. If he could survive that encounter, what could mere human anger do to him? Later that morning, Jacob saw them coming, Esau and his 400 men, approaching like a cloud of dust across the plain. But Jacob was no longer the same man who had cowered in fear the night before. He arranged his family carefully, putting the servants and their children first, then Leah and her children, and finally Rachel and Joseph. Then Jacob did something that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of hanging back in fear, he went ahead of them all and bowed himself to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. It was the gesture of a vassal to a king, acknowledging Esau's position and power. But Esau's response was not what anyone expected. Instead of anger or coldness, instead of the revenge that Jacob had feared for 20 years, Esau ran to meet his brother. He embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they both wept. The reconciliation was complete and immediate. When Esau asked about the droves of animals he had encountered on his way, Jacob's elaborate gifts, Jacob explained that they were intended to find favor in his brother's eyes. But Esau, now wealthy and powerful in his own right, said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." The brothers were reconciled, but more than that, Jacob had been transformed. The night of wrestling had changed him from a man who lived by cunning and deception into one who could face truth about himself, about God, about his relationships with others. He was no longer Jacob the supplanter, but Israel, the one who strives with God. The blessing he had stolen so many years before had been confirmed through honest struggle. The fear that had driven him from his homeland had been conquered not through clever schemes, but through direct encounter with the divine. The brother he had wronged had forgiven him, not because of gifts or manipulation, but because time and God's providence had worked healing in both their hearts. Jacob, now Israel, had learned that the most important wrestling matches are not won through trickery, but through persistence, not through deception, but through honest struggle, not through avoiding our fears, but through facing them directly. His limp would remind him forever of the night he wrestled with God and discovered that in losing, in being wounded and humbled, he had actually won the greatest victory of his life. The man who had once grasped his brother's heel had finally learned to grasp something far more valuable: the blessing of God himself, earned not through cunning, but through the honest struggle of a soul desperate for divine approval. In wrestling with God, he had also wrestled with his own nature and had emerged transformed. If this story has touched you, subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share with someone who might need it.